In the scorching July of 1187, the most formidable army the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled was not destroyed by the sword or the lance, but by a far more ancient and cruel enemy: thirst. In a barren and desolate landscape, under a sun that hammered down without mercy, the greatest knights of Christendom, encased in heavy chainmail, collapsed from their horses, delirious with dehydration. In the distance, like a cruel mirage, they could see the blue, life-saving waters of the Sea of Galilee, an unattainable paradise. This is not the chronicle of a conventional battle. It is the story of how Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, prepared not a battlefield, but a death trap of epic scale, using the terrain and the sun as his most lethal weapons. The legend of the Battle of Hattin is that of a victory achieved before the first arrow was loosed. Saladin's genius lay not in a cavalry charge or a brilliant tactical maneuver in the heat of combat, but in a masterful and patient campaign of psychological warfare and reverse logistics. Through a coldly calculated provocation, the siege of the city of Tiberias, he forced the Crusader army to make the one decision that would guarantee its annihilation: to abandon its secure, water-rich base for a suicidal 25-kilometer march across a lifeless desert. Saladin did not need to defeat the Crusader army in honorable combat. He only needed to ensure that the desert would do it for him, slowly and agonizingly. This is, therefore, the epic of an underdog leader who unified the Muslim world and who, facing a theoretically superior military force, chose intelligence over brute strength. It is the story of how patience, strategy, and a profound understanding of the terrain and the enemy's psychology can dismantle the most arrogant of giants. Saladin did not fight the Crusaders. He guided them into a hell of his own making. What we are about to witness is not just a battle, but one of the most brilliant deception operations in military history, an immortal lesson in how the mind of a single man can turn an enemy's greatest asset, its military might, into the instrument of its own destruction. At the heart of the gathering storm was An-Nasir Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. This Kurdish leader was no mere warlord, but the man who had achieved the impossible, uniting the often feuding Muslim factions from Egypt to Syria under a single banner. He was a patient, calculating man, driven by an unshakable religious fervor to expel the Franks from the Holy Land. His army was a reflection of his leadership, a force of 30,000 men, fast, mobile, and perfectly adapted to the terrain, composed of his elite Mamluk cavalry, lethal Turkish horse archers, and volunteer infantry. His cause was jihad, his ultimate goal, the reconquest of the holy city of Jerusalem. Opposite him stood the giant, the kingdom of Jerusalem, but it was a giant with feet of clay, eaten away by an internal division that made it dysfunctional and predictable. The command was a nest of vipers. The king, Guy of Lusignan, was a weak and indecisive man, easily swayed. At his side, Reynald of Chatillon, an arrogant, reckless, and bloodthirsty noble whose breaking of a truce by attacking a Muslim caravan had given Saladin the perfect excuse for war. And as the voice of reason, constantly ignored, was Raymond III of Tripoli, a shrewd strategist who knew the terrain and advocated for a caution his peers mistook for cowardice. This fracture in leadership was the crack through which Saladin planned to destroy their kingdom. Despite their flawed leaders, the Crusaders' military force was the largest the kingdom had ever assembled. Some 20,000 men, a formidable number for the era, filled its ranks. Their spearhead, the tactical nuclear weapon of the Middle Ages, was 1,200 heavily armored knights, the embodiment of an almost unstoppable shock power. Supported by the elite military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, and more than 15,000 infantrymen, they seemed invincible on an open battlefield. But their strength was the source of their arrogance. They underestimated Saladin's discipline and patience, and fatally overestimated their own ability to project their power onto a hostile terrain that forgave no mistakes. The chessboard chosen by Saladin was the arid and desolate plateau between Sepphoris and Tiberias. Sepphoris was the Crusaders' base of operations, an oasis with abundant wells and pastures, a haven of life. Tiberias, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, was the bait. Between these 2 points stretched an infernal landscape, a natural trap with not a single source of water, under the scorching heat of July. This terrain became Saladin's primary weapon. It allowed his light and fast horse archers to harass and retreat at will, while the heavy and slow crusaders baked inside their armor. The final destination of this death march would be a twin-peaked hill known as the Horns of Hattin. Saladin's masterstroke was not military, but purely psychological. By besieging Tiberias, a fortress belonging to the wife of Raymond of Tripoli, he created an impossible dilemma for the Crusader leadership. He knew, with diabolical cunning, that Raymond, the man whose wife was in danger, would paradoxically be the one to advise against marching, for he understood it was an obvious trap. Saladin anticipated that this caution would be the perfect trigger for his rivals, the warmongering Reynald of Châtillon and the fanatical Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, to publicly accuse him of cowardice and treason. The pressure on the weak King Guy would be unbearable. Saladin was not attacking a city. He was attacking the egos of his enemies. The trap was set. In the war council held at Sepphoris on the night of July 2nd, the fate of the Kingdom of Jerusalem hung in the balance. Logic clashed with arrogance, strategy with impulsiveness. The greatest army Christendom had ever deployed in the Holy Land was about to make a decision that would lead it to glory or to total annihilation in the desert. The most intelligent battle in history is about to begin, decided not by force, but by the mind of one man. If you wish to witness how intelligence can annihilate power, make sure you are subscribed and have activated notifications, because Saladin's masterclass is about to be unveiled. On the night of July 2nd, in King Guy's tent at Sepphoris, history was sealed. Raymond of Tripoli, with the wisdom forged by years of experience fighting on that very land, implored the king and the nobles not to fall into the trap. He argued passionately that marching on Tiberias was suicide, that it was exactly what Saladin wanted, to leave their secure position with its abundant water sources. To cross the desert would be to hand victory to the Sultan without a fight. Losing Tiberias was a lesser evil, he insisted, compared to risking the entire army and with it, the whole kingdom. His logic was impeccable, his warning prophetic. He was the voice of reason in a room full of pride, but reason was drowned out by the shouts of foolishness. Reynald of Châtillon and Gerard de Riedfort, Raymond's bitter enemies, saw their chance. They accused Raymond of cowardice and, worse, of treason. Their venomous words seeped into the insecure King Guy, who feared appearing weak if he followed the cautious advice. Caught between logic and the pressure from his more aggressive barons, Guy made the worst possible decision. He overturned the initial plan to remain on the defensive and ordered the army to march at dawn to relieve Tiberias. At that moment, in the safety of their camp, the Crusader army was sentenced to death. Saladin's trap had worked to perfection. At dawn on July 3rd, the great Crusader army left the springs of Sepphoris and began its slow, heavy march into hell. The summer sun rose in the sky, and with it, the temperature. Almost immediately, Saladin's trap became visible. Swarms of Turkish horse archers appeared on the flanks and rear of the Crusader column. They did not seek a pitched battle. Their tactic was that of 1,000 cuts, like a swarm of lethal wasps. They would ride in, fire a volley of arrows into the dense formation, and retreat before the heavy Christian cavalry could react. Their goal was not to kill, but to wound, harass, frustrate, and above all, to slow the march. Each attack forced the column to halt, to form a defensive line, expending precious energy under a sun that grew increasingly brutal. The knights, encased in armor that became ovens, and the infantry, burdened with their gear, began to suffer the ravages of thirst. The water they carried in their skins was consumed at an alarming rate, precisely as Saladin had planned. The march became a torture, a slow pilgrimage towards annihilation. The Sultan was not fighting them with an army, but with the climate itself, turning every kilometer of advance into a small defeat for the Crusaders. By late afternoon, exhausted, demoralized, and desperate for water, the Crusaders reached a ridge from which, for a moment, hope was reborn in their hearts. They could see the blue waters of the Sea of Galilee, but hope turned to horror. Between them and the water, completely blocking their path, now stood Saladin's main army, deployed in battle order. The escape route was cut off. The harassing attacks throughout the day had not been the main battle. They had been merely the shepherd dog guiding the flock to the slaughterhouse. The trap, which had been open all day, had just snapped shut. Forced to halt, The Crusaders had no choice but to make camp for the night on a dry, desolate plateau, completely surrounded by Saladin's army. There was no water, no relief, and then Saladin added a further psychological torture to his plan. During the night, his men set fire to the dry grass surrounding the Crusader camp. The thick, choking smoke filled the air, adding misery to the soldiers' unbearable thirst. As the Crusaders coughed and suffered, they could hear the chants and prayers of Saladin's men, who had unlimited access to water brought by camels from the nearby lake. The morning of July 4th, 1187, dawned on an army already defeated. What followed was not a battle, but an extermination. The Crusader infantry, driven mad by thirst and suffering, broke ranks, disobeying orders. Thousands of foot soldiers attempted a desperate, suicidal charge down the hill, trying to fight their way to the water. They were mercilessly slaughtered by Saladin's forces, who were simply waiting for them. The backbone of the Crusader army disintegrated in a chaos of desperation, leaving the knights completely exposed and unprotected. The army had ceased to be a fighting force and had become a mob of dying men. The knights, the elite of Christendom, attempted several heroic but futile charges. Their horses, as dehydrated as they were, could barely trot. The charges that would normally have shattered any infantry line became slow, ponderous advances, easily repelled by the arrows and lances of Saladin's army. One by one, the great lords of the kingdom fell or were captured. A small group, including King Guy and Reynald of Châtillon, managed to fight their way to the summit of the Horns of Hattin, where they made a last, desperate stand around their most sacred possession, the relic of the true cross. The final moral blow came when, in the heat of combat, the true cross was captured by Saladin's forces. For the Crusaders, this was an unmistakable sign of God's abandonment. What little will to fight they had left evaporated. Surrounded, exhausted, without water and without hope, the last stand on the Horns of Hattin collapsed. Finally, King Guy's red tent, the last bastion of resistance, was pulled down. The king and the surviving nobles were captured. The battle was over. The largest army the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever assembled had been utterly annihilated. Saladin watched from a nearby hill. His plan, conceived with extraordinary patience and foresight, had been executed to perfection. He had used his enemies' pride as a weapon against them. He had turned their greatest strength, the heavy knights, into a weakness by luring them onto terrain where their armor became a tomb. He had used the sun, thirst, and desperation as his chief allies. He had not simply won a battle. He had orchestrated a masterpiece of strategy, a symphony of destruction, where every note had been played exactly as he had composed it. The battlefield fell silent, covered by the bodies of thousands of Christian soldiers. The crows were already beginning to gather. Saladin's victory was total, absolute, and irrefutable. He had proven that a brilliant mind could overcome the most formidable force. The underdog had not just defeated the giant, but had done so in a manner so intelligent and decisive that his legend would be forever etched in the annals of military history as the man who trapped an army with nothing more than bait, the sun, and the foolishness of his adversaries. The annihilation at Hattin was not an accident of fate or a stroke of luck. It was the inevitable result of a chain of predictable decisions, all of them anticipated and exploited by Saladin. Every step the Crusaders took after leaving Sepphoris was a step into the grave the Sultan had dug for them. The battle was not truly fought on July 4th, it was fought in the minds of the commanders 2 days earlier. Saladin was simply there to collect the fruits of his intellectual victory, a victory so complete it would change the map of the Holy Land forever. The immediate aftermath of the battle was the near total annihilation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military strength. Of the approximately 20,000 men who had marched from Sepphoris, it is estimated that fewer than 3,000 managed to escape the slaughter. The vast majority were either killed on the battlefield or, worse, captured to be sold into slavery. In the course of a single day, the kingdom's ability to defend itself militarily simply ceased to exist. All the military orders, all the barons, all the levied soldiers, the flower of Frankish power had evaporated under the Galilean sun. The fate of the captured commanders was a reflection of Saladin's code of honor and justice. King Guy of Lusignan, despite his incompetence, was brought to Saladin's tent and treated with the courtesy due a monarch. For Reynald of Chatillon, however, there would be no mercy. Saladin had long marked him as a truce-breaker, a bandit, and a murderer. After a brief exchange of words, Saladin himself drew his sword and beheaded him, fulfilling a personal oath to punish Reynald's crimes. It was an act of implacable justice that resonated throughout the Muslim and Christian worlds. With the Crusader army destroyed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was left completely defenseless. The victory at Hattin was not an end in itself, but the key that unlocked every door. In the following months, Saladin and his army swept through the kingdom, capturing city after city, castle after castle, most of which surrendered without a fight upon learning that no relief army was coming. The climax of this lightning campaign came less than 3 months later, on October 2nd, 1187, when Saladin entered the city of Jerusalem in triumph, fulfilling his life's goal and reversing nearly a century of Christian control. Politically, the Battle of Hattin was one of the most decisive in medieval history. The fall of Jerusalem, the direct consequence of the battle, dealt a devastating blow to Christendom. The primary objective of the entire Crusader movement, the possession of the Holy City, had been lost. This event shocked Europe to its core, sparking a wave of grief, anger, and renewed religious fervor. The news of Jerusalem's fall was the direct catalyst that triggered the Third Crusade, a massive undertaking led by Europe's most powerful monarchs, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. For the Islamic world, Hattin became a foundational myth of victory and unity. It was Saladin's greatest victory, the culmination of his personal jihad, and proof that, when united, Muslims could expel the Frankish invaders. Saladin became a legend, not just as a conqueror, but as a just and chivalrous leader, an image that even his Christian enemies came to respect. The battle became a powerful symbol of Islamic resistance and the recovery of holy lands, an event whose memory would be invoked for centuries as a moment of divinely favored glory and triumph. From a military perspective, Hattin became a timeless case study on the importance of logistics, strategy, and psychological warfare. It demonstrated conclusively that an army cannot fight if it cannot drink, and that terrain can be a more deadly weapon than any sword. Saladin taught the world that knowing your opponent's psychological weaknesses is as important as knowing their military strengths. The battle is a perfect example of a strategic victory over a tactical victory, where the outcome is decided long before the main forces make contact. Its legacy is a warning to all arrogant generals throughout history. The legend of Saladin, forged in the heat of Hattin, transcended religious divides. He became a figure of immense respect, even in Christian Europe, where he was immortalized in literature as the epitome of the noble Saracen. His victory was not seen as an act of barbarism, but as the result of strategic genius and, in the case of the reconquest of Jerusalem, of surprising magnanimity. Unlike the massacre perpetrated by the First Crusaders in 1099, Saladin forbade slaughter and allowed citizens to buy their freedom. Thus, the man who annihilated the Crusader army also won the admiration of his enemies. There is a final detail, a moment after the battle, that perfectly captures the essence of Saladin as a strategist and as a man. In his tent, with King Guy and Reynald of Chatillon as his prisoners, Saladin called for a cup of rose-scented iced water and offered it to the thirsty king. Guy drank greedily and then, by custom, passed the cup to Reynald. It was then that Saladin, through his interpreter Bide, said with chilling calm, "Tell the king that it was he, and not I, who gave this man drink." This seemingly simple gesture was, in fact, a death sentence with impeccable logic. According to the sacred Arab law of hospitality, offering a prisoner food or drink meant that his life would be spared. By making that distinction, Saladin was demonstrating that his hospitality extended to the king, but not to the man he considered an oath-breaking criminal. Reynaldi, by drinking from that cup, had not received Saladin's protection, but simply a final sip of water from another prisoner. Moments later, his fate was sealed. The most intelligent battle in history did not end with the last cry on the field, but with a silent gesture and a sentence that proved Saladin's mind never stopped calculating.